There are two domains in aerobic exercise training: continuous and interval. During continuous aerobic training, the intensity is either in the lower end of the aerobic training zone, just above the first ventilatory threshold, where a noticeable change in breathing occurs, which corresponds with about a 4 on a 1 to 10 effort or rate of perceived fatigue scale, and can be sustained by most able-bodied people for 60 minutes or greater. The middle of the aerobic training zone, in between the first and second ventilatory thresholds, where breathing starts to become both faster and deeper, which corresponds with about a 5 on a 1 to 10 effort or rate of perceived fatigue scale, and can be sustained by most able-bodied people for about 30 to 60 minutes, or the upper end of the aerobic training zone, near the second ventilatory threshold, where the person is now huffing and puffing, which corresponds with about a 6 to 6.5 on a 1 to 10 effort or rate of perceived fatigue scale, and can be sustained by most able-bodied people for about 15 to 30 minutes. Once the intensity rises above the second ventilatory threshold, the person is no longer exercising aerobically. They've now entered the anaerobic exercise domain, which can only be sustained in short bursts. These short bursts are known as work intervals, and they are quickly followed by rest intervals so that the cardiorespiratory system has time to recover before performing another short burst of high-intensity work. The length of both the work and rest intervals are determined partially by where in the anaerobic domain the intensity lies, partially by the effort the person feels like putting into it, and partially by the person's level of fitness. In the lower end of the anaerobic domain, just above the second ventilatory threshold, where the effort or rate of perceived fatigue is about a 7 or 8 on a 1 to 10 scale, most able-bodied people can sustain the intensity for about 2 to 4 minutes. This type of interval training is known as high-intensity interval training, and while rest periods can vary widely, a general recommendation is that rest period lengths correspond with a 1-to-1 ratio. For example, if the work portion lasts for 3 minutes, the rest period should also last for 3 minutes. For general fitness, following a warm-up that lasts for about 5 minutes, the person can cycle through these work-rest interval cycles about 3 to 6 times and follow that with a cool-down. In the higher end of the anaerobic domain, the effort is now at or very near maximal. The person is sprinting, and this is known as sprint interval training. Rate of perceived effort is a 9 to 10 on a 1 to 10 scale. It is impossible to sustain this effort for greater than 30 seconds, and the sprint usually lasts for a minimum of 10 seconds. For general fitness, rest-to-work ratios during sprint interval training usually correspond with a 6-to-1 to 3-to-1 ratio. Less fit people, or people who are just starting out, should begin with a 6-to-1 ratio. For example, if the person sprints for 20 seconds, they should then rest for 120 seconds, or 2 minutes, prior to their next sprint. Similar to high-intensity interval training, and following a warm-up, they can cycle through these rest periods 3 to 6 times and end with a cool-down. During rest periods, the general recommendation is to rest passively, in other words, stop exercising completely, or to rest actively, which means reduce the intensity to near or even below the first ventilatory threshold, which corresponds with being in the low end of the aerobic training zone, or even below that intensity. My recommendation is to rest actively rather than passively. A nice, light, active rest period until it's time for another short burst of work. Another recommendation is to start a little conservatively and then progress. An example would be to cycle through work-rest periods 3 or 4 times and then progress to 5 or 6 times once 3 or 4 is no longer as challenging. Another example would be to reduce the duration of the work portion, such as a 2-minute work portion when performing high-intensity interval training, or a 10-second sprint when performing sprint interval training, and then progress the duration once that is no longer as challenging. I wouldn't recommend aerobic interval training more than twice per week if the person is also strength training as part of their overall exercise program, and I'd include low to moderate continuous training as part of the overall aerobic training program because the body and mind can't sustain high intensity over long periods. It's really good to vary intensities and include lower intensity training as a way to downregulate. Another important thing to understand is that no one should be prescribed aerobic interval training until they can show they're able to sustain continuous aerobic training in the middle of their aerobic training zone for a minimum of 15 to 20 minutes. It's also critical to understand and adhere to the following ACSM guidelines. So that's a quick overview of the difference between high-intensity interval and sprint interval training, to include some general program design guidelines for each. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and happy exercising.